throughout the Bible, we have a number of people that we would call heroes of the faith. In Hebrews chapter 11, there's a list of some of these people as they talk about the works that they did and the faith that they had. And one of the people on that list is a man named David. And in this study, we're going to look at the life of David. David was a son. He was a shepherd boy. He was a soldier, and he was a king, one of the kings of Israel. And so we're going to take a look at the different segments and stories of his life that we find in the Bible and ask the question, what can we learn from the life of David? So Saul is not really pleased with David. Why? Because David is getting the loyalty of his son. He's getting the praise from the people. And as we'll see here, he also starts to get the love from Saul's daughter as well. And here's the thing. David is a servant of Saul. Saul has given him tasks to do, and he's done well in those. And instead of finding joy in that and being pleased with his servant, he's resentful, he's jealous, he does become hateful, and he doesn't handle these situations well. He's recognizing that God is taking him out of the position that he holds dear as king, naturally. That's a position you're going to want to hold on to. But God has rejected Saul as king, and he's not handling that well. And in the next section of text, Saul does a truly awful thing, and it's miserable. He becomes what would be one of the worst father-in-laws in history. And so let's have a look, shall we? In 1 Samuel chapter 18, starting in verse 20, we get the text for today. It says, "Now Saul's daughter Michal loved David, and when it was reported to Saul, it pleased him. I'll give her to him, Saul thought. She'll be a trap for him, and the hand of the Philistines will be against him. So Saul said to David a second time, 'You can now be my son-in-law.' Saul then ordered his servants, 'Speak to David in private and tell him, look, the king is pleased with you, and all the servants love you. Therefore you should become the king's son-in-law.' Saul's servants reported these words directly to David, but he replied, 'Is it trivial in your sight to become the king's son-in-law? I am a poor commoner.' The servants reported back to Saul, 'These are the words David spoke.' Then Saul replied, 'Say this to David, the king desires no other bride price except 100 Philistine foreskins to take revenge on his enemies.' Actually, Saul intended to cause David's death at the hands of the Philistines." This is a pretty awful thing. So Saul recognizes that his daughter is in love with David. And he decides, why not? Why not put these two together? Now, in David's sight, this didn't make sense. His response there was like, is it not a trivial thing to you to become the king's son-in-law? Like, that's a big deal. That's not something to take lightly, is what he's saying there. And he says, I'm just a poor commoner. I can't afford that, right? Like, at the time, right, you would pay a bride price to the father of the bride for his daughter. It was just a normal custom of the day. And so he's like, there's no way I can pay that. And so Saul's response to him, he gets his servants to tell him, I'm going to waive that fee. Don't worry about it. Just bring me 100 Philistine foreskins. And I know that it sounds like a gross thing today. At some level it is, obviously. But if you think about it, the Jewish men, they were all circumcised. And so this was a way to show that you had collected the bounty on someone, like a bounty hunter, bringing back proof of death kind of thing. And so this is what Saul does. He says, you go out, you kill 100 of my enemies, bring me proof of that, and we'll call it even. But he was not intending to give his daughter to David. His intent was that the Philistines would win against David, and David would be killed and problem would be solved. What a horrible thing to do. This is a guy who you have given a number of tasks and he has done them all with excellence. And this is how you reward him? Because of jealousy, because of resentment, because of hatred, because he couldn't handle someone else rising while he is falling. Huge mistake. But let's see what happens. What happens here? This is not the end of David. In verse 26, we pick up. When the servants reported these terms to David, he was pleased to become the king's son-in-law. Before the wedding day arrived, David and his men went out and killed 200 Philistines. He brought their foreskins and presented them as full payment to the king to become his son-in-law. Then Saul gave his daughter Michal to be his wife. Saul realized that the Lord was with David and that his daughter Michal loved him, and he became even more afraid of David. As a result, Saul was David's enemy from then on. Every time the Philistine commanders came out to fight, David was more successful than all of Saul's officers, so his name became well known. And so here Saul has the realization that this is more than just the people liking David. God's Spirit is on him. And it says that he became more fearful of him. And now, I mean, this is a guy who has proved himself in war, so there should be a healthy fear of him, naturally, right? Like, he's a dangerous guy. He's controlled, but he's dangerous. He should not have become his enemy. There was no reason for him to become his enemy other than Saul's sinful desire to hold on to position and power that was no longer his jealousy, his resentment. And what can we learn from this? You're going to go through times in your life where you want to hold on to things that God's saying that's no longer for you. And maybe it's because it's become a problem for you. This power that Saul had led him into a place where he cared more about what the people thought of him than what God thought of him. And so God takes that power from him. And Saul's response should have been one of repentance, one of saying, yeah, you're right. This was wrong of me. You put in place the person that you want to be in power, and I'll support that person, and I'll support that choice, and I'll do whatever you ask of me. That should have been his response. That should be our response. When we see God lifting someone up into a position of power or authority or giving them a role or something, and maybe it's something that we even had or that we have desired, our desire first and foremost should be that God's will be done. And if that means that someone else gets the thing or job or power or whatever that we want, we recognize, well, no, God is in control. It's His will first and foremost, and He knows what's best. I'm not building up my kingdom. I'm building up God's kingdom. Saul couldn't do that. He held on to the power too much. He loved it too much. But as I've said, God's will be done. It will be done. No matter what you do, you can't stand in the way of it. God's will be done. And so you have a choice. You can stand opposed to it and fight it every chance you get like Saul did. Or you can stand back like David and just, God, you're going to do what you're going to do. I will be faithful and I will do what you ask of me. That should be our response. May we be pleased with the will of God when it lifts us up and when it brings us down. That God is faithful, He is in control, and it's His kingdom we're building, not our own.